you very much. What I'll do now is I will introduce to our first speakers, Kahryn and Anna. Professors, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, James. I'm now just going to turn my video off and just share the slides. So if I could just have some feedback, if you can see those before I start, that'd be really helpful. Thanks.
The screen sharing started. We can see your slides. They're not in slideshow mode yet.
There we go. Is that okay? That should be in slideshow mode
Absolutely
now.
Fine.
Wonderful, thank you. So good morning, everybody. My name's Dr. Anna Tarrant, and I'd just like to begin by thanking James for inviting us to present today, and also to Alicia for organising the webinar and the kind of practical side of things. Our reflections in the presentation today were actually written up in a blog that Kahryn and I wrote back in July, which feels like such a long time ago now, for the Digital Curation Centre based in Edinburgh. We'd actually written two posts, one making a case for qualitative data reuse and the associated methods and strategies of qualitative secondary analysis as a useful method to adopt and use in the context of the pandemic as part of a broader repertoire of qualitative methods, and also for conducting at a social distance as well. The second was the Digital Data Curation Centre blog, Digital Curation Centre blog, where we developed our arguments that we present here today around the value of adopting an ethical temporal sensibility towards qualitative data. So Kahryn and I were really excited to receive this invitation, and also to have the opportunity to share some of our reflections with a slightly different audience than we usually speak to. It's also our first presentation on qualitative methods together as well. So for us, it's a really nice opportunity to talk about the things that we talk about all the time, but to a wider audience. So a brief overview and roadmap to our talk today then. So we begin by saying a little bit about ourselves and our position in these discussions, and also our orientation to questions of data sharing and ethics from the perspective of qualitative researchers. And then we move on to discuss our arguments. Overall, our presentation considers the value and implications of what we call a temporal ethical sensibility towards qualitative data, its generation, reuse, and also its preservation. So its preservation typically in archives. To advance this perspective, we situate our observations first in the context of the datafication of social life. We point to the increase of data infrastructures for the preservation of qualitative data, and then place this in context of broader societal processes that characterize a society that wants to know itself, but only has partial data and therefore the knowledge to do so. We consider the different kinds of qualitative data that can be generated and stored, and also what special qualities qualitative data have. Before introducing Timescapes Archive, which we're both intimately connected to through our work. So the Timescapes Archive in brief is a specialist qualitative longitudinal resource of data, and has basically informed a lot of our thinking and introduced us to key thinkers in the field who have been informed by the data sets that are available there. We then move on to make our case about the importance of building time into our ethical reflections, arguing that when you do that, you're able to engage much more with questions of data lifetimes and challenge the current ethos of data protectionism that characterises the current terms of debate around what we do with qualitative data. We suggest that an orientation to data lifetimes allows you to think through the different needs of the different people that will be using those data throughout the lifetimes of those data. And in doing so, we then can begin to think in a more nuanced way about different kinds of ethics and the kinds of ethics that different people need to consider at different times and in different situations when they come to use those data. And we argue for two different kinds or approaches to ethics, so a proactive and a reactive ethics, and also new models of data stewardship. For us, this then leads us to forward an agenda for data justice, and we provide some more information about that as the presentation progresses. So that's a brief overview of what we're here to argue today. And there will be plenty of opportunities for questions as well at the end of the session. And we're going to pose some questions to you as an audience as well, so that we can understand what our reflections might be contributing to debates around data sharing and ethics. So brief introduction to me. So I'm an associate professor in sociology at the University of Lincoln. I'm also a UKRI Future Leader Fellow as well. So I was awarded £1.2 million through the second strand of funding. And I'm the director for Following Young Fathers Further, which is a qualitative longitudinal study of the lives and support needs of young fathers aged 25 and under. My research builds on a baseline study called Following Young Fathers, which was directed by Professor Bren Neal and Carmen Lau-Clayton. And again, that was a qualitative longitudinal study exploring the same themes. My project essentially extends the findings from Following Young Fathers, but also is working on different methodologies for data preservation and archiving, and again is intimately connected to the Timescapes Archive. I'm just going to pass over briefly to Kahryn to introduce herself now.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So I'm Kahryn Hughes. I'm an associate professor in sociology at the University of Leeds. I'm the director of the Timescapes Archive. And I led a study under the original Timescapes programme that was a £5 million investment by the ESRC to investigate questions of qualitative longitudinal data and methods, how we might develop methods in those directions, but also to develop methods around qualitative data reuse, so what Anna and I describe as qualitative secondary analysis. And in that original programme, we were tasked with setting up the Timescapes Archive, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But we did that with help from the UK Data Service.
Thanks, Kahryn. We've also recently just published a edited collection, leaders in the field in this area. So we've basically pulled together a collection of chapters from leaders across the UK and also Ireland to really map out this field. It's a relatively new field. Data reuse is pretty accepted, especially with the use of quantitative data. But debates and discussion around qualitative secondary analysis began probably only around 20 years ago. So it's a very new area. And what we'll do is in the next slide is talk a bit about the contexts that have shaped the rise in questions of reusing qualitative data. But we do encourage you to go and have a look at that book. It covers a range of different topics, from researching across multiple data sets all the way through to teaching with existing data sets and encouraging students to become engaged in data sharing and analysis as well. So again, kind of this is a fledgling field, but one that's starting to consolidate and really sort of find a place, if you like, in this broader repertoire of qualitative methods, and that's something that Kahryn and I sought to consolidate through this book. So that's us. So to begin with then, again, we begin by providing some context to our thinking, namely about why there's been a rise of qualitative data archives and shifts towards qualitative data preservation. And we've observed several different processes that we think have fueled this over the past 2 decades. The first is the massive growth in data infrastructures, both in the UK and also internationally. And we note here just perhaps some more recognisable qualitative data resources on the slide, just to give a flavour of some of the diversity and wealth of data that's now available to researchers. So that includes those held by the UK Data Service, the Mass Observation Archive, the Northern Ireland Qualitative Archive, and of course also the Timescapes Archive, as we've mentioned. The US, Canada and Australia have also seen a huge growth in research data archives and also scholastic debate supporting the reuse of data within them. In the UK in particular, innovations and methods associated with data reuse and qualitative secondary analysis have burgeoned, as I mentioned, in the last decade particularly, and again, as kind of captured by the edited collection we mentioned. Much of this work, we would argue, could be attributed to the Timescapes programme of research in the archive. The programme of research built in a specific strand to actually explore the development of methods of qualitative secondary analysis, and then also more practical issues and pragmatic issues around how data sharing can happen, and then ethical questions related to that. So again, key names that have contributed to these debates include Sarah Irwin, Libby Bishop, and then of course Bren Neal as well. Ros Edwards and their colleagues, who are doing really interesting work around big qualitative data, and then our own work looking at QSA strategies. These changing attitudes towards qualitative data reuse and sharing also characterise new priorities set by European funding councils as well. So they increasingly require the reuse of extant data while also minimising collection of new data. Qualitative data produced through funded research is an expensive resource to produce, and it's one that was often being lost. So very often individual researchers were responsibilised to keep hold of their own data and then actually destroy them after a certain period of time. So Jennifer Mason in particular, in early debates and discussions about qualitative secondary analysis and data reuse, tried to move beyond sort of moralistic positions about whether we should use that data to how we use that data. Qualitative data reuse has also become important in a context in the current research climate, where investments are increasingly directed towards big data-driven approaches to both identifying and addressing globally relevant social questions. There's therefore a challenge for social scientists to remain distinctive in what we're seeing as a new data world. And this is something that Mike Savage and Roger Burrows comment on. Processes of datafication have led to a massive tsunami or explosion of data about ourselves, but also an appetite for those data and for generating them. And there's no sign that that might diminish. They describe this as a form of knowing capitalism. Ros Edwards and Janet Holland have also recently published in a special issue in the International Journal of Social Research Methods, headed up by Kahryn and Jason Hughes, and also Fabienne of Lecoq, I think her surname is, and make a case for reforging a methodological terrain in a climate characterised by neoliberal orientations towards speed, effectiveness, and also big quantitative data. They argue essentially that in these contexts, the special qualities of qualitative data raise new questions and also potentially foster new opportunities for new innovations. Essentially, the use of qualitative data is taking place in a really complex terrain, and it's something that requires that additional consideration, particularly in terms of how we do this in an ethical and valuable way. So just a brief point here about what is special about qualitative data. We argue that qualitative data are special because of their particular qualities. As mentioned, they're expensive. They're also difficult and time consuming to generate. So my current study, is a cost of £1.2 million for 4 years. It pays for research staff to go out into the field. It takes time to access and identify participants, and often working with a range of different stakeholders. Data then needs to be transcribed and then, of course, analysed as well. And all of that takes a huge amount of investment. They're also creative and can be text-based and visual. So again, the way in which we interpret those data can also be creative and innovative, but also requires particular standards and rigour. They're often small scale in terms of sample size, and less likely to claim to generalisability, and also deeply personal for both the participant and the researcher. And certainly early debate focused very much on researcher needs and responsibilities towards data. And again, we unpick that and critique that a bit further, a bit more later on in the presentation. We also just want to reflect very briefly on what we mean by qualitative data. So qualitative data is hugely diverse and varied. So here are just a few examples of some of the kinds of data that are available in the Timescapes Archive, for example, or that we've worked with. So in the image here, we have a picture of a future timeline developed by a young father in the Following Young Fathers study. And this is been described by the team as a tool for thinking with, so conducted alongside qualitative interviews with young dads, with the idea of thinking prospectively and getting the young dads to think about their future aspirations, and then these being mapped onto their existing experiences and their discussions of their futures. There's a slight error on this slide I've noticed, but underneath that we have a written transcript that's been developed from an audio slide. I might just take us out of the presentation if that's okay, just to take that off. Sorry for that. Here we go. So an audio transcript there. This is an example of a relationship map, again, developed for the Young Lives and Times project, where a young person's been asked to think about their social relationships and their networks. And then also here, an example of a written essay. And of course, archives hold things like diaries, photographs, all those kinds of data, and all of those are increasingly becoming accessible for future researchers to be able to have a look at and also develop new knowledge from. So now pass over to Kahryn.
Yeah, so these special qualities of qualitative data require additional sorts of forms of ethical reflection, and these are intensified when we begin to think about not only how we generate them in primary research, but then how other researchers come to those data, how might they access them, how might they treat them. So there are this sort of like standard ethical concerns that are, you know, infuse all debates around, for example, the research use of data are amplified here around qualitative data reuse. So this one, consent, if in primary research, how might we seek consents from participants when the intention is, for example, to archive the data for the purposes of reuse, where consent can't possibly be informed because researchers, the originating researchers, can't anticipate how in the next 5 years, 20 years, 200 years, if we're lucky, those data are going to be used. So there's a shift from informed consent to enduring consent around how those consents are sought from participants, whereby researchers undertake to ensure that even where there is uncertainty or ambiguity about how those data might be used by future researchers, that they will be used ethically, both the storing of those data, the reuse of them, and the protections around those data will be sustained over time. There were questions around anonymisation, which they shift in the context of data reuse, whereby the intention is to keep qualitative data as intact as possible so that their reuse can be as profitable or as complete as it is possible to be. So the qualities of those data need to be sustained over time. But for example, you know, one example is people's names. That names of people's children often they characterize an era, they characterize localities, they may characterize a culture or a nationality. So for example, even that simple process of changing names comes both with a number of challenges when we put those data in the context of questions of reuse. These data are also, as Anna has already said, they're very, very personal and they're about personal lives. So often when we're collecting qualitative data, people are not only talking about themselves, but they're talking about all the other people that they live with. So the people, you know, and the people that they live for. Everybody's name, you know, Uncle Joe and, you know, the Sister Margaret or whoever that is, you know, family names. Things like bus routes, road names, house names. All of these very, very identifying features are systematically captured with qualitative research data. So how do we keep the integrity of those data and preserve that for future researchers? So those enhanced ethical questions. Questions around confidentiality, therefore, also come into play, because how can data be kept confidential when the intention is to reusing, we're making it available for other people? But also the participants within research studies that are archived are visible within those archives. And finally, questions around representation, how we speak as researchers on behalf of others, is a very hotly contested issue that, particularly in the social sciences, has had a really long history. And when you begin to build questions of time in this, you know, how can we represent people over time? Again, in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, where our own connection as researchers with the temporal context of those data originators becomes increasingly distantiated. So these questions were, both Anna and I, we've talked about the original Timescapes programme. Here's the URL for the Timescapes Archive. If you go to the Timescapes Archive website, there's a link to the original programme, which can, if you're interested in it at all, that it will give you lots of information around it, all the information about the data sets and the researchers that produce them, and the sorts of questions and concerns that they worked on. There's also, if you look at those publications and outputs on the top banner, there are all the original working papers from that original Timescapes programme, which deal with and identify these enhanced ethical questions. So as I said originally, the Timescapes programme of research gave rise to the archive, and its development was supported by the UK Data Service. So I think I'm ready to move on to the next slide, Anna. So the archive itself, it regulates who deposits data and who reuses those data. We have legally binding contracts of data reuse. Only bona fide researchers are granted permissions to access or to register for the archive and to access the data. And the archive itself has got quite granulated levels of access controls. So some of the strategies that we use are, for example, time embargo, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So some data are held in what might be described as the dark archive. So it's not visible to registered users. And the open access here is not open access to everybody, only to registered users, but they have access to all the available data sets. But there are data sets which are completely restricted and for which special permissions need to be sought from the originating research teams. Obviously, as time goes on, there are questions around the sustainability of those special permissions as people leave the profession or obviously die. You know, we're lost to the world, and those permissions won't be in place. And so comments on that would be quite helpful at the end of this session. But one of the impacts of all of these different sorts of controls and strategies for managing and regulating people's access to data once they've registered within the archive means that data users are really visible, both to the archive management team, but also to data generators as well. So the restrictions that I've mentioned in the previous slide build out of a much longer history of ethical engagement in data reuse, but also the ethics debates that characterise the development of social sciences research over the last 40, 50 years. So these sorts of debates, these historical ethical concerns, include those that I've mentioned already, but additionally things like data privacy, data linkage, confidentiality and anonymity. In the social sciences, there are some other anxieties that have very long histories. I mean, earlier Anna talked about people destroying their research data, and that was seen to be, for a very, very long time, the ethical thing to do, that you protected everybody in your research by destroying those data. Nobody would be able to get hold of them, and however well-intentioned would be able then to treat those data badly, and in that way treat the participants of the research badly. So key concerns were these questions around the fears that both the researchers and the participants would be misrepresented. One of the things about qualitative data is that researchers are really implicated in it. You know, if you read a transcript, for example, you read all the questions that a researcher poses, and those might be planned as part of the research, but then there's all the little asides and digressions, often within qualitative research, part of developing what has been described as a conversation with a purpose, and that's by Jennifer Mason, is to establish rapport. So people are required to develop conversations and share information about themselves. So researchers are really present, their interests, the language that they use, the way in which they interact with participants, those are captured and recorded as part of research data. So it's not only the participants that might be misrepresented, but also the researchers, and there have been cases of this in the past. Fears that data will be exploited for unethical purposes, and that harks back to those concerns around whether or not the research will be used for the purposes that were formed part of the original intentions of the originating researchers, and that the originating researchers might not agree even that those sorts of questions ought to be brought to their own data. There are these other fears that people will be made vulnerable in some way because the personal bits of their data won't be treated sensitively enough, and other aspects, more pragmatic concerns, that if you deposit data, for example, in an archive, for those pragmatic reasons that research teams disband, they move institutions. The institutions themselves don't have the facilities to provide simultaneous access to data for different researchers of those originating teams, and able to sustain and organise them in ways which facilitates their reuse. That if you archive them in that way, that other people might be able to get hold of those data first and publish out of them before the data originators. And so things like time embargo, that's one of the strategies. That's why we have time embargo in the Timescapes Archive, in order to protect against those things. We've used that strategy very successfully. But these sorts of questions, these sorts of debates, Anna and I, our work is taking a more critical stance on approaches to these questions which seek to layer in more and more and more protections.
Thanks, Kahryn. And I think what's really interesting, particularly for me at the moment, is that these questions were being dealt with in the context of the Timescapes programme of research almost a decade ago now.
Yeah.
But I'm currently working on another project, COVID Realities, which involves a consortium of different research teams, and we're looking at questions of data aggregation in the current context, but then also future possibilities for for qualitative secondary analysis. And we're really having to challenge a kind of competitive ethos around data and data use, and trying to develop this more kind of collaborative and then also temporally orientated kind of approach that then allows us to do the kinds of work that allow us to speak to policy change as it's happening in real time, but then also think about how we maintain data for the historical record as well. So these concerns are ever present and prevalent, and particularly in these kind of big consortium type projects that involve that sort of collation or collation of data, if you like. So yes, just moving on. My screen has frozen. I can't seem to move on. Sorry, it's gone to the end. So our questions then coalesce around building a temporal ethical sensibility towards data reuse. And for us, particularly sort of theoretically, epistemologically, we argue for building time into questions and ethics of data reuse. We pose two questions. So what can we achieve if we foreground a temporal ethical sensibility rather than a risk ethics? And then also, what do we achieve if we move away from a focus on data generators and actually think about the lifetimes of data, which is a point I made earlier on in the presentation. So Kahryn's just going to talk briefly now about some of our suggestions, particularly around a sort of proactive and a reactive form of ethics that then enable us to think and facilitate time in context of qualitative data reuse.
Yeah, so when we begin thinking about proactive and reactive ethics, and these are terms that came from work by Bren Neal in her book on qualitative longitudinal data. If we think longitudinally, not only about the research methods that we use and our mode of engagement within one study, but think longitudinally around, as Anna has said, lifetimes of data, we begin to recognise that there's a need to move beyond this special character of data, qualitative or otherwise. So in primary fieldwork, our ethics on data need to be proactive. So we go through, for example, ethical review and so forth, in order to ensure that we have built in ample thinking and work around how we're going to engage ethically with our participants and conduct our research. And that proactive ethics considers the entirety of the research process. But obviously anyone who's done any sort of research with human subjects knows that stuff crops up and it's difficult, it's problematic, it's unanticipated, we don't know what to do. And it's something that is described in work by Ros Edwards and Tina Miller, emergent, we can take an emergent negotiated approach to developing new ethical strategies in the field, in the situations in which we find ourselves in research. And so those ethics can be negotiated amongst researchers within the research teams, but also between the researchers and the participants of the research themselves. So you can ask people, well, how would you like this to go? You know, what your preference is. When we put that in, when we think about this reactive ethics, it engages us in thinking about longer term processes and relationships. It begins to hook us into a broader set of questions. And where we're thinking about the reuse of data and archiving data, we're able to think about how data are going to be ingested, how data are going to be stored, who's going to have access to them, how we're going to manage those sorts of things. And so these are a form of proactive ethics whereby we can begin to think longitudinally about not only the lifetimes of data, but about all of those people who are going to be involved in managing and curating and reusing those data, as well as the original researchers, the original participants and so forth. So we're not only thinking about stages in research, but we're also thinking about the relationships between all of those different stakeholders or data stewards. And where situations crop up, so taking this temporal approach allows us to think through where situations crop up, to think of them as ethical cases, situations in which that offer us new opportunities for reflection, development and innovation. So we can build in opportunities for these reactive ethics when we begin to think temporally and longitudinally. And in that way, we're not always thinking about a once and for all or an either-or situation, either between should we go proactively or should we go reactively. Actually, there's a combination of both. We don't need to, just sit within one approach. And it allows archives, it allows regulations and so forth, or different forms of protections to change in ways which suit new circumstances, new legislative contexts, for example, or new social sensibilities around data privacy.
Absolutely, and this is something that we're trying to develop in and through the Following Your Fathers Further study. This study is based again on an ethos of co-production. So we've been engaging directly with participants, trying to inform them about the possibilities of archiving, but also give them options and opportunities for thinking about what happens to their data once it's been generated. One thing that's been really interesting is developing the data management plan. I say interesting, it might not be everyone's cup of tea, that, but developing a data management plan that captures these new sensibilities and then really feeds into new ways of actually, fostering this environment of data sharing, particularly with qualitative data. So what we've done in Following Your Fathers Further is develop an information sheet that enables enduring consents. We've also suggested shared copyright of all of our data with participants. And I've been picked up on this a few times with some concerns about what happens if you do that. This is again based on work by Bren Neal and also Maureen Harker in personal communication with her. And essentially what that allows is participants to be able to have a right and a say over what happens to their data. So if they decide in the longer term that they no longer want their data to be available to other researchers, it allows them to then come back and say, I'd like that to be removed and taken out. There's also a difference here between personal data, so data about the participants and maybe demographic data, their age, where they live, all those kinds of really key contextual metadata that's required or will be required by future researchers, and then also transcripts. So the Timescapes Archive, for example, offers a dark archive, so this data goes under restricted access and won't be made available until the end of the life of the participant, so much further on into the future. So the ability to respond sort of flexibly to those different kinds of data is also essential to this process. So I'm just going to, conscious of time, so I'm just going to move on from how we then think about data. And what we would suggest actually is this really significant shift from a data stewards model that moves us beyond the protectionist ownership type approach to data. What this does is it allows us to recognise those relationships that Kahryn's describing and include also all of those people who look after the data at different points in time, albeit potentially not doing the same thing all the time with those data. So if we think more about different sets of interests in relation to data, we can also think about stakeholders. So people like curators, reusers, generators, a combination of all of these at different points in the lifetimes of those data. Back to Kahryn.
So I'd forgotten the slide order actually. So data rights, data justice. So I think when we're thinking these things through, you can't take a solely protectionist stance towards qualitative data. And as I said, it's not an either or question. And it might be useful to think about data rights, you know, a focus on, you know, the rights of the different stakeholders in the lifetimes of data as a form of proactive ethics, what we can anticipate. But then data justice as concerning more reactive questions. We make decisions as they emerge. And the point here is that historically, particularly in social sciences research, what's happened is that the more vulnerable, as people, you know, the participants have been described, the more vulnerable participants have been, the more protective researchers have been over those data. Those participants are most likely to be people who are living on the margin, you know, social margins, isolated, very unlikely to be included in, for example, big panel surveys or have any form of political participation. They're also, because of socioeconomic constraints, least likely to appear in transactional data as well. So then those who are most vulnerable to being lost from the social record. So here, this builds on work by Alina Denzik and her team. To take an overly protectionist stance around qualitative data is actually to almost double silence, double mute marginalised people or people in vulnerable social contexts. So the idea of data justice is that if we begin to think temporally, we begin to think along data stewards, how people take care of data longitudinally, that we begin to engage with questions about how those very sensitive data can be sustained longer term. And so those people's accounts can become part of the longer social historical record. So we can still attend to these key ethical priorities around contextualizing data for reusers and prohibiting unethical reuse, but the temporal ethical sensibility allows us then to begin to use the language of legacy and stewardship and data sustainability, even when those data are highly personal. They really identify the person that they were generated with.
Brilliant, thanks, Kahryn. So we're going to finish now then. We see this as an ongoing conversation, ongoing set of discussions and debates. So we just want to re-emphasise our expertise obviously predominantly focuses on qualitative research data and its preservation and ethics, and we're keen to understand sort of the broad replicability of what we're doing and constructing arguments for. So we're going to throw these questions out now. I'm conscious that of time and everything, and you may have some slightly different questions that we can respond to later. But we ask you, so what perspectives are you approaching questions of data integrity from? And then which of our ideas have you found interesting and why, and what context might they most apply to? So thank you very much, as I said, for the opportunity for Kahryn and I to share our ongoing discussions, and we look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. That was fascinating. Okay, what we have now is we've got about 10 minutes for some initial questions, and then while there'll be another speaker when we resume after the pause for 11 o'clock, we will be all having about sort of the last 15 minutes of the webinar. All the panelists are available for questions. So maybe one thing we can't do with now, we can pick up at the end then. Okay, so I've had a few questions come in while you were speaking. Christopher Taylor asks, how has the GDPR framing of anonymization and pseudo-anonymization affected research practice with qualitative data?
It is proving quite challenging, to say the least. With GDPR, there are some exceptions around research data and how but there is an ambiguity around the extent to which anonymization can, is acceptable. So those are questions that we are still dealing with in the Timescapes Archive. So one of the things that we're having to do at the moment is to hold off data sets from each other and to regulate how people traverse the various data sets as well, in terms of their access to data. So these aren't resolved questions at all. But at the moment, it's very much about how you might build in where you build in consents. The thing about social sciences research data, when it's qualitative data, I mean, I know you've experienced this as well, is that often participants want to be known. It's one of the few opportunities that they get to speak. So the idea of them being anonymised and protected so that other people don't even get to hear what it is that they're saying becomes really unethical and very contradictory. You know, it contradicts what participants themselves want. So both the originating researchers, but also for the Timescapes Archive itself, there are a set of judgments that are careful judgments that need to be made. But this isn't a conversation that is in any way concluded at all. This is something that we are absolutely talking through at the moment.
Yeah, I do think as well, so mentioned in the slide on proactive ethics, building in an opportunity to talk about archiving and data preservation with participants, it brings them into that conversation, and it allows you to then understand their perspectives on whether and how their data should be preserved in archives. And again, this sort of sharing of copyright helps with that process, I think. So it allows them to have some level of control over how their data is used, because they do change their minds sometimes, you know, and that should be okay. But if you assign copyright over just to the researcher, then you reduce the power that the participants have to then respond to that use of that data. So again, there are implications of that for GDPR. But I think having those conversations in the longer term and building that proactively into archiving information sheets and consent forms can sort of help support and facilitate some of that process.
Yeah. And also just to say that, you know, the Timescapes Archive is an open access. You know, so how there are, you know, that one of the things is that I think ethics is, the focus is always on this, you know, proactive, but how people can be identified, you know, that there are ways of regulating that, and also a whole host of strategies around double anonymisation and so forth in any sort of published outputs to ensure that participants can't be identified. So it's that balance between where the responsibilities lie. You know, is it that you ask the originating researchers to strip everything out of the data so that future researchers can't use it and participants feel let down because their data has lost its value in effect? Or do you put those responsibilities longer term within, you know, we write within disciplines, you know, our work is peer reviewed when, you know, before it's published and so on and so forth. And so there are numerous opportunities for ethical scrutiny that take place after someone has used those data. So again, this is our temporal, you know, if you take this temporal approach, you can begin to build in lots of opportunities for ethical scrutiny. So it's not about throwing data out there and letting everybody know all about individuals. It's about understanding where the checks and balances lie, and where one of those concerns is around data sustainability.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I think you've also answered another question, which was some participant asked for whether advice on anonymisation, pseudonymisation should be used just both or just one of them. I think you covered that as well. Okay, looking at a couple of other questions. How do you comply with data protection requirements for personal data of people who are not in the participants in the research project?
So I think we need a little bit more clarity on who that's included.
The question was anonymous. The person who asked that question, you could maybe give some additional information.
Maybe
expand the question. We'll look at it later. Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned linkage in relation to COVID-19 study. Sorry. Okay.
I was just thinking. Sorry, I just wanted to make a little point around anonymisation processes as theoretically driven as well. So there's a balance to be had between ensuring data quality and integrity, and then also protecting participant rights. So we're currently anonymising data for Following Your Fathers Further at the moment, and I really having to think. We've got a code book. We're having to think really carefully about how we represent participants, what we take out, what we keep in, and that's it's a fine balance and something that you know, we're trying to think through at the moment and hoping to publish on.
We've had some clarification on that question. The question was asking, so envisioning scenarios where participants disclose the personal data of other people who aren't participants in the research project.
They always do.
For example,
all qualitative research, that is, they tell you everything about everybody all the time. And that is what qualitative research is about. It's trying to understand people in context. You're trying to understand how and why people might be making the decisions that they make, what their interpretations and understandings are around the social world. And we know that we live with and for others. We don't live as isolated beings. If I were to say to anybody who's watching this, tell me about yourself, and you could speak for an hour without talking about anyone else in your life, I'd be really quite astonished. So the idea of particularly in the social sciences of qualitative research is entirely to capture a sense of those sorts of relationships, the character of those relationships, and significant events in those. So that is what is really distinctive about social sciences research. So again, this idea of what you do, to what extent do you then pseudonymize participants? Now, there are strategies in transcription that are used systematically. So where a name is put in, people might put in son, daughter, or number people, so that all of those details are taken out and they're kept in a key. So those are concerns. But if you think about, I'm just thinking about the digital panopticon that's being run through Liverpool University, that is using Old Bailey records of people who were transported and bringing those into conversation with the diaries and accounts of those people who were transported. Absolutely every single personal detail of those people's lives is recorded there, who they were with, who else was transported, and so on and so forth. So there are aspects, if we build in time, when might someone need to use personal data? When might they need to have access to those personal data about the participants? Why might they need that? I think these are things that are need to be subject to scrutiny. Why might you want, do you really need somebody's address? Do you really need to, what sort of personal data do you need to? When the transcripts themselves are so saturated with these personal details, that Anna and I, we work with those details. You can't take them out. So where does the emphasis lie? Is it that you then report the names of everybody in an excerpt of text in your published paper that's been analysing those data, or is there, is that, you double anonymise, you make sure that nobody can possibly identify those people. So it's that, again, it's coming back to this thing around open access and registered access and scrutiny, and who's available for scrutiny over time.